Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Carrie Ann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts. And this is a show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community and beyond. Today, I wanted to talk about bipolar disorder. A lot of times I've heard people kind of casually refer to someone they know or themselves as, quote, bipolar. And I wanted to kind of clarify what it really means to be bipolar. According to the website Mental Health America, about 2.3 million Americans have bipolar disorder. And on the same website, it mentions that Black Americans experience bipolar disorder at the same rates as all Americans. But the difference is in how they receive treatment. I also just wanted to mention that bipolar disorder tends to first kind of show its signs and symptoms around late adolescence. And that's kind of just an average. Of course, there's going to be some people who maybe a kind of a smaller number of people that might show symptoms a little bit earlier than that. And then there's quite a few adults who first get their diagnosis in adulthood, but they can sometimes trace back the first warning signs to when they were younger. So basically, if you experience frequent mood changes, does that mean that you have bipolar disorder? In psychiatry, what we look for with bipolar disorder are distinct episodes of mania. And a lot of people use the word mania, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think of in psychiatry when we say the word mania. Okay, so if you've ever observed someone, maybe someone you know, that has had a manic episode, you may recognize some of the things I'm about to talk about. One is that, and probably the thing that is striking to a lot of people, is a shift in baseline in terms of their energy level. So you'll find a very high energy. The person is just kind of going, and they don't seem to be slowing down. They just don't seem tired. In fact, they seem the opposite of tired. They may be up late at night, working on things, not really needing very much sleep. They may, maybe just get an hour sleep or so on, and they kind of wake up refreshed and ready to go. A bit like kind of like the Energizer Bunny, for people that still know that reference. And the second part to think about is, I also just wanted to mention, it's very common for people with bipolar disorder to have sleep difficulty. So even if they're not necessarily highly energetic, people who have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder often have just sleep difficulty at baseline, difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, that sort of thing. That's just the biology of the illness. The other thing that can go along with a high energy is rapid speech. So a person who's in a manic episode may often be speaking a lot more quickly than they usually do, to the point where people are telling them to slow down, or a person may find it difficult to follow their conversation, or they may find them very difficult to interrupt. So once they start speaking, you may be looking for a window to kind of join the conversation and kind of contribute, but the person is just talking so much that it ends up being very much a one-sided conversation for the most part. And even if you're talking to them, you can kind of see them almost like waiting to kind of like jump in the conversation again. They're impatient. They may not even be fully listening to you. They're just waiting to kind of, when can I talk again? Ready to talk again. Along with the rapid speech, you may find that the content of the conversation is tangential. So they'll start off with topic A, but something about topic A leads them to topic B. So they start talking about topic B. And then something about topic B leads them to topic C. So they start talking about topic C. And before you know it, they're at topic XYZ, right? And so if they're talking really quickly, it can be difficult to follow them. But if you pay attention really closely, you can see how each of the things are interlinked. It just kind of took you off in a different direction. So that kind of tangentiality, we call it flight of ideas. The ideas are kind of somewhat interconnected, but they just kind of fly off in a tangential direction. So you may find that, you know, they may also have some difficulty with focus, some distractibility. In fact, I would want to say that because I do child psychiatry, a lot of times when people are first starting to show some signs of bipolar disorder, these subtle signs, sometimes people often think they might have ADHD because they're finding it so difficult to focus and stay on track. But distractibility and difficulty with concentration can also be a part of bipolar disorder. In fact, inattention is a part of so many diagnoses that we always say inattention doesn't mean you have ADHD. So that's why it's important to see a specialist, to see a psychiatrist. But people with bipolar disorder may have difficulty with concentration and focus. They may be distractible. So we talked a little bit about sleep, energy, speech. And the other thing that can happen when people are in a manic episode is that people may end up having this feeling that we call grandiosity. And it can kind of look a little bit different in different people. So sometimes it looks like making really, really big plans, like super ambitious plans, sometimes plans that are pretty much impossible, or they're minimally possible, or they're otherwise just really, really ambitious. And you combine that with a high energy, and you get someone up late at night trying to work through some super ambitious, grandiose plan. So that can happen. The other way that grandiosity can kind of play out too is feeling kind of grandiose feelings about your own abilities. So you may, for example, be a piano player or a musician, and you just feel like you're the best musician in the world. You're the best musician that ever existed in the history of music. And that's just a grandiose idea about yourself. That can happen when a person is in a manic state. They just have this feeling of grandiosity. And again, combining that with low sleep and a lot of energy, you have someone who's doing something that is kind of they're moving really quickly, but are they really achieving something that is productive? So now the other thing, and this can cause a lot of disruption, and this can come out of the idea of being grandiose, thinking that you have superpowers, having a lot of energy, not sleeping, is that people in mania can sometimes end up having very reckless behaviors. So this can look like a lot of things. One example that I've come across many times is a person who's manic, grandiose, full of energy, and they will drive at dangerously high speeds on the highway or the side roads. And they may be doing that on their own, or they may even have passengers in the car, maybe their own children, and they're driving at dangerously high speeds. They may be spending a lot of money, maxing out their credit cards on unnecessary purchases. Again, in that moment, just feeling very inspired, feeling like this is something that they need to do and that it's the right thing to do, having a good feeling about making all of these purchases. They may end up having hypersexual behavior, again, a shift from their baseline of what they would, their usual behavior. So the key here with mania is that it is a shift from your baseline. It's a distinct shift from your baseline. When you're not manic, you probably wouldn't be doing a lot of these things in the same way. So as you can see so far, it can range from, you start off with high energy, but it can snowball into reckless behavior, dangerous behavior, inadvertently hurting yourself and other people. So it's a very serious thing. And it's why I wanted to kind of just, even though this is kind of a brief overview today, it's like a kind of a quick 20-minute overview of bipolar disorder, I wanted to cover it. One of the important things to note about bipolar disorder is that it can affect insight. So what I mean by that is the person who's experiencing a manic episode may not have a full awareness that they are that there's a problem. So sometimes they have almost no awareness that there's a problem. They think, hey, I feel great. I feel super creative and inspired. Things are going well. They may not realize at all. But sometimes they know that there's something that's wrong, but they minimize it. So they'll say, yeah, I have a little bit more energy than usual, but it's not a big deal. It's fine. Everything is fine. And so what happens is that they may not bring themselves to treatment. Sometimes it is a family member that brings them to treatment. Sometimes it's the police that brings them to treatment, particularly if they are driving at high speeds on on the highway and things like that. The other thing that can sometimes get the police involved is, or even just a family involved too, is just the idea that when you're in a manic state, your mood may be volatile. So, as I mentioned, a manic episode can last a number of days. But what can happen is that you can be feeling great, even unnaturally happy, going along, high energy, feeling productive, and then very quickly suddenly feel very irritable and super angry, even agitated or aggressive. And this is something I've seen as a psychiatrist, I've seen in the emergency department, I've seen in the hospital, is someone in a manic episode who may go from singing because they're so happy to suddenly kind of like charging at people because they're so aggressive. And so the person's mood can be very volatile when they're in a manic state. And this is, again, part of the reason why it's really important to then bring them to treatment for their safety and for the safety of others. And again, now, as I mentioned all these characteristics of mania, not everybody has this, okay? Not everybody experiences mania exactly the same way. What I'm talking about are just some of the things that can happen when a person is in a manic episode, and just to impress on you that this is something that it affects a lot of people, and just kind of what it looks like when it's not really appropriately treated, or when maybe someone doesn't realize that they have the disorder, okay? Then, as I mentioned, this is bipolar. So there's two poles to this illness. We talked about the mania kind of pole, but the opposite of the mania is a depression. So the other pole of this is depression. And, if you didn't know that a person had the bipolar kind of illness and they came to you with depression, you may think that it's a major depressive disorder, or just kind of the typical kind of clinical depression. Is that the symptoms can look very similar in many ways. But part of what makes a bipolar depression so disabling is that contrast. So you can start off in that high energy, manic place and then crash and end up in a depressive place. You're in bed for days, not showering, not really eating regularly, not able to function. It can be such a disabling condition. And there's also the risk of suicidality, which, is higher in people that have bipolar disorder. And it can, obviously in a depressive state, if you're hit with a severe contrasting kind of depression, you can also have a high risk for suicide. In a kind of a grandiose manic state, you have a risk for hurting yourself as well, because of how much your insight is affected. The other thing, and this is going to have some relevance to us in the Black community, is that people with bipolar disorder can sometimes have symptoms of psychosis. They have misperceptions, like delusions. So you can have paranoid delusions. Somebody's following you, people are talking about you. You may even consider the grandiosity to be grandiose delusions, that you have superpowers and that you can do much more than you think you can do. Some people even experience hallucinations where they might hear whispering, or they think that they heard someone say something about them. And that's the kind of situation where someone may go from being happy to suddenly being angry because they perceive that someone said something about them, and their mood is just volatile and they may react to these perceptions. Now, this kind of misperceptions or psychosis, they're more common when a person is in an episode, like a manic episode or a depressive episode, and it tends to improve when the episode resolves, when they're not in an episode. The issue, though, is that once a person starts to have psychotic symptoms, they, healthcare workers and providers start to wonder whether they have schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is not the same illness as bipolar disorder, but psychosis is one of the core features of schizophrenia. So once people start to have symptoms of psychosis, you wonder, do they have bipolar disorder with psychotic features, or do they have schizophrenia? Okay. It can be a complicated issue for psychiatrists to discern, and it actually has been a very well-known disparity that Black patients, when placed in this scenario with providers, are more likely to receive a diagnosis of schizophrenia rather than bipolar disorder when they present with the same symptoms as other patients. Okay. Now, this is significant for a number of reasons. Not only is schizophrenia a different illness, but to be fair, it is perceived differently in society and in medicine. Schizophrenia has a different prognosis. It's an illness in and of itself. We treat it. A lot of people have been successfully treated for schizophrenia and they're moving along with their lives. But schizophrenia tends to be accompanied by what we call in a decrease in what we call cognitive functioning. So, for example, if you're a student in school and you start to experience schizophrenia, your grades may start to drop. Or if you're at work, your work functioning may drop. And that's because schizophrenia tends to be accompanied with a thought disorganization that can make it very difficult to achieve the life goals that you initially set out to achieve. So people with schizophrenia can sometimes end up on disability benefits because of how difficult it may be to keep a regular job. There's maybe challenges with maintaining kind of consistent employment sometimes. So it's seen with an illness. It's seen as an illness. It just has a different prognosis than bipolar disorder. So that kind of makes it interesting that Black patients are more likely to end up with this diagnosis that has a worse prognosis when they present with the exact same symptoms as other people. And, even if you're not a provider, if you're just a lay person, you can tell the difference in some ways, because I'll tell you that in my experience, just talking to people just on a regular basis, people tend to be relatively less embarrassed to disclose that they have bipolar disorder. But if they have a schizophrenia, they would be much more secretive or much more private about disclosing that they had that diagnosis. Why is that? Right? So even if you're not a provider, you can tell that there's an importance with being able to make the correct diagnosis. If your correct diagnosis is schizophrenia, then that's what it is, and you get the appropriate treatment for that. But if it's bipolar disorder, then it needs to be appropriately diagnosed and treated. Okay. If a person walks into my office and I know, like, okay, primary diagnosis is bipolar disorder, I may start with medication X. But if they walk into my office and I know primary diagnosis schizophrenia, I may start with medication Y. So it does affect the treatment. Even though there is a lot of overlap with the medications that can be used in both conditions, there are still some subtle differences that can be really important in achieving stabilization and preventing hospitalization. Okay. So, again, what does it say about us in the medical establishment that we have this bias of diagnosing Black patients as schizophrenia when we're on the fence between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder? So bipolar disorder can be very disabling. And particularly because it affects insight, people who have bipolar disorder sometimes don't really want to take medication for it. And that could be for a lot of reasons. I mean, again, sometimes it's the kind of the grandiosity of like, well, I feel better. I don't really think I need it. The insight is affected. Sometimes it has to do with how the medications make a person feel. So sometimes people take medications for bipolar disorder and it feels like it's kind of flatlined their emotions rather than just help them to regulate it. Sometimes people feel happier when they have a little bit of mania, like just a little bit. They feel a bit more creative, a little bit more energetic, and they feel like the medications take that away. So they sometimes try to reduce their dose on their own, or they try to stop the medications, and that can cause some instability as well. So it's really important to work with your provider to try to find the right balance for you. And if your provider is not listening to you, or you feel like you can't collaborate with them, you may want to potentially even consider trying a different provider that may be able to listen to what your needs are, for your daily functioning, and to listen to what you believe, what you've been experiencing, in terms of side effects. So when a person is properly and adequately treated for bipolar disorder, they are usually able to kind of move forward with their life. They can achieve their particular career goals, and they can achieve their educational goals. And it's a very kind of treatable illness. Now, if you have bipolar disorder plus something else, so you have bipolar disorder plus OCD or plus PTSD, you may have a slightly different trajectory because now you need to have these other conditions addressed and treated. So I'm not talking about that today. Today's just a quick 20-minute on bipolar only. But just know that if you have bipolar plus something else, it may not be that simple as just finding the right medication, okay? So along with this idea of medications and taking the right medication, I wanted to also just acknowledge that in the Black community, we have a very complicated relationship with the idea of taking medications. We are kind of socialized, I am socialized to believe in natural remedies, and that natural remedies are the ideal and that they're kind of the cure-all. However, even though I'm a big supporter of natural remedies, I also am very, very experienced with treating bipolar disorder. And it can fall under the category of a severe mental illness, and it's very, very biological. And so medication is actually a really, really important part of the treatment for bipolar disorder, okay? Now, you can do individual therapy in the sense that individual therapy can help you with quality of life issues, with processing the illness, and it can help you to deal with maybe some of the issues, like problems that have happened during times when you were in an episode, the way that it's affected your family, kind of repairing relationships and things like that. However, the therapy can't actually treat the illness. It can help to support your recovery, but medications are a really, really important part of treating bipolar disorder. Okay. Then once you get on an effective medication regimen, you're probably going to be on it long term. Okay. This is not the kind of illness where you want to try a bunch of times to take yourself off of meds. And part of it is that every time you experience a manic episode, it has an influence on the brain. And once you have a manic episode, you can keep having them, and it makes the brain kind of more easily slip into a manic episode. So one of our goals with medication is to try to prevent manic episodes altogether, try to stop them from happening. And some people are able to do that for years on the right medication regimen, actually prevent manic episodes from happening. The other thing is that you may need to try more than one medication to find the right one that works well for you. And it's that right balance between benefits and side effects. So high benefits, low side effects. You may have to try more than one to find the right thing. Also, when you find the right medication for mania, sometimes it helps with everything, but sometimes it doesn't help as much with the depressive episode. So you may need a second medication to help with the depressive episode. So you may find yourself on two medications potentially. Again, this is all things you're going to discuss with your psychiatrist as you collaborate on your custom-made regimen for the treatment of your illness. What you don't want to do is turn to alcohol and drugs, okay? So people with bipolar disorder have a higher risk of substance use. And I mean, I get it, Imagine if you're frequently experiencing a lot of emotional turmoil, and when you drink or when you smoke marijuana, you feel a momentary numbing of that emotion. It's kind of a relief from that emotional turmoil. So it feels kind of good. So you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And before you know it, you now have a dependence on alcohol or marijuana or drugs to help to give you this kind of temporary relief. But what's happening is that you're kind of receiving this temporary relief in exchange for an overall worsening of your illness. So use of substances actually functions to make your mood more volatile in the long run, makes your illness worse. And so you've given this, the exchange is not a good one. Momentary relief for an overall worse illness is not a good exchange. Easy for me to sit here and tell you that, but it is true. The other thing that just to be mindful of is, you have bipolar disorder. Once you develop a substance dependence, you now have a second diagnosis. That's going to make it more difficult to treat the bipolar disorder, but also you just have something else that you need to treat. So now you have two illnesses to treat instead of one. So it's really, really important to try to think about the level of disability that substance abuse can cause and that bipolar disorder can cause, and the kind of damage that it can do to families to have both illnesses. Okay. So are you bipolar? Well, one of the biggest misconceptions about bipolar disorder is that it's just about feeling rapid mood changes. It's not about just rapid mood changes, okay? I've talked to people who feel like their mood can change dramatically within the same day. It doesn't feel good, but it might not be bipolar disorder necessarily. Because as I mentioned earlier, manic episodes can last a few days or more. So having your mood change every couple of hours could be due to other things. And one big culprit is actually trauma. Trauma affects a part of the brain that's involved with emotional reasoning and emotional regulation. People who have trauma often have triggers that they may or may not be fully aware of. So particularly if you may not be aware of some of your triggers, your mood may change quickly in response to a trigger. But if you don't recognize a trigger, then you may think your mood is changing randomly. It's something that could just feel disconcerting. But if you work with a therapist, that's actually one of the ways a therapist can be helpful is they can help you to recognize your triggers. They kind of help you trace back and figure out what's going on. So one of the biggest triggers I want to just mention that people miss, because what happens with trauma is that people tend to realize the environmental triggers. So they think about, when I'm in this place or I see this thing, it triggers me. But interpersonal triggers tend to be triggers within like conversations and interpersonal relationships, okay? We underestimate the power of these kinds of relational triggers, okay? So sometimes people might be in a conversation and somebody disagrees with them, and suddenly they have a dramatic change in mood. The rest of their day is a bad day. Or someone confronts them about something that they did wrong. They hold them accountable for something. Suddenly their mood has changed and the rest of the day is a bad day. Or they've made a request of somebody and the person has said no. And suddenly their mood has completely dramatically shifted. That might not be bipolar disorder. Those are interpersonal triggers. And that's something you can meet with a therapist and work through with a therapist. Now, you can still benefit from meeting with a psychiatrist because mood changes in and of themselves, even if they're not bipolar disorder, they may be due to something else, right? And a psychiatrist might be able to diagnose whether or not you have a legitimate reason to take a mood stabilizer. Mood stabilizers are the medications that we use to treat bipolar disorder and sometimes other conditions for which people experience mood shifts. So you may still be a candidate for a mood stabilizer, even if you don't have bipolar disorder, but that's something you want to meet with a specialist and discuss to kind of figure out if that's the right thing for you. So guys, are you bipolar? Well, guys, you can't just listen to a podcast and diagnose yourself with bipolar disorder. I would never recommend that. You need to meet with a psychiatrist. You need to meet with a specialist and receive a proper evaluation. to tell whether or not you have bipolar disorder and to get the correct treatment. You can go to my website. I have a resource page where there you can find a directory for how you can get in contact with mental health providers. Some of them will be therapists, some of them might be psychiatrists, and try to get kind of set up for an evaluation to figure out what's really going on for you. Sometimes you need more than one appointment to finish your complete consultation to get the appropriate diagnosis. So that was my quick 20 minutes on bipolar disorder. I couldn't cover everything, but tell me, what did I miss? What do you know about bipolar disorder? What do you want to share? Sometimes things that you share in the comment section can be helpful to other people. So drop a comment and have a happy long weekend, guys. Here in the US, tomorrow is President's Day. So we have an extra day off. But thank you so much for listening to Black Mental Health Matters, and I will talk with you again next week.